other. So, Madam, I
Thank you so much.
inviting Madam for COVID presentation.
So, good evening, everyone. First of all, I thank the team IMA Padam, led by Dr. Babu and Dr. Anish for giving me this opportunity. Going straight to my job, that is a topic on COVID infection in children.
Madam, mute ayyo, unmute cheyane, madam. Ija madam, unmute cheyane.
I hope now I'm visible and heard.
Yes, madam.
So, first of all, thanks to the team led by Dr. Babu Chandran and Dr. Anish Krishnan for giving me this opportunity. So, coming straight to my topic, that is COVID-19 infection in children. So, what I plan to cover would be an acute COVID infection, the pathology, clinical presentation, and risk stratification, treatment options, and of course, definitely the diagnosis of MISC and treatment. So, first of all, why are children less affected? We know that all said and done, the acute infection in children are definitely less compared to the adults. There are several postulations, which include differences in expression, affinity, and distribution of the ACE receptors. Children have a robust endothelium. They are not damaged by your age-related changes. They have less inflammation. And that is also the reason why, even when the D-dimers are high, their chance of coagulation is less compared to the adult population. And obesity and diabetes are very important comorbidities as far as severity of acute COVID-19 is considered, and that is also lesser in children. It is also postulated that vitamin D deficiency is more common in adults, and vitamin D deficiency because vitamin D is associated with anti-inflammatory and antioxidative properties. Please remember, these are just postulations. They don't have very strong scientific basis for that. Another postulation is that because children have stronger innate immunity or trained immunity. What we mean by this is that normally when you're taking a vaccine, what you get is an adaptive immunity. But when you are taking a vaccine, it's not only the adaptive immunity, it has been found that it trains your native immunity or the innate immunity, because of which you may get a non-specific protection against another pathogen. So this has been seen especially with BCG, where BCG vaccination has been associated with decreased incidence of infant mortality as well as decreased sepsis and respiratory infection. So one assumption is that probably recent vaccination is giving you a better trained immunity, and that might be the reason why you are having lesser infection in children. And also higher melatonin levels associated with decreased expression of AC inhibitor, AC receptors are also considered as one of the postulations. So we start with the newborn care. We all know that the newborn transmission is mainly in the postnatal period. So there are very few case reports of transmission in the antenatal period, but for all practical purposes, we need to think that the newborn gets infected either during the time of delivery or post-delivery and not in the antenatal period. Mostly the infection is asymptomatic, but can have respiratory distress and GI symptoms. But the problem is a newborn symptomatology would be very much similar to what you commonly see in a newborn. The GI symptoms are not common in a newborn, but definitely respiratory distress happens in newborn due to varied etiologies. It may be prematurity, it may be a meconium aspiration, it may be a TTN, it may mimic. But for practical purpose, we don't have to distinguish between the two. At that stage, there is nothing specific in treatment for a newborn. It is mainly supportive care. Increased severity is also seen in preterms and babies with underlying disease. But here again, a word of caution, we are definitely seeing COVID acute infection in newborns now. That is newborns who have been discharged home and then coming back with a classical adult type of COVID lung infiltrates. So that also needs to be kept in mind, especially when a baby is coming back to you after getting discharged with a respiratory symptom. Now, as far as the delivery room care is considered, apart from the PPE and the routine care, that's nothing different. Post-delivery, the baby can be roomed in with the mother. The risk of infection to the neonate is same, whether the baby is nursed in separate room or in the mother's room. So it's better to room in with the mother. but all caregivers, including the mother, should wear a mask, because the chance of infection spread to the baby, as I already said, is in the postnatal. And practice hand hygiene before and after touching the baby. Clean and disinfect any surface, especially the ones that you frequently touch. It may be the tabletops, it may be your doorknobs that needs to be cleaned frequently. And there is no need to wash your breast before feeding. But in case you're coughing, you're having a symptomatic infection and you have not put a mask, and if you're coughing onto the chest, then definitely cleaning before breastfeeding is recommended. But remember that mother is unlikely to transmit if she has had a mild illness and it is more than 10 days since the onset of symptom. Then she can do away with these precautions that we said and can care for her baby just like a routine mother. If the mother has had a severe symptom, it would be preferable that mother continues with the protection maneuvers till 20 days after the onset of symptoms and at least 24 hours before the patient does not have a fever without an antipyretic. So that is how long the mother has to take the precautions of not being the transmitter of the disease to the baby. So from now, moving on from the newborn, coming to the routine immunization. So here what I am discussing is not exactly a newborn immunization. It includes both the newborn as well as other children beyond the newborn period. So remember, we need to provide immunization as per schedule if stable. So every opportunity a child comes to your OPD, use it to ask for the immunization history and provide him with the vaccination that is due. If the patient has a contact with a COVID positive, then wait for 14 days, because naturally that 14 days is the quarantine period and you do not want the patient to come to the hospital. A symptomatic period also, you are infectious, so you don't want it to be a source of infection to the others. If COVID-19 is confirmed, you need to wait for 2 weeks after symptom resolution or after you are negative. So naturally, we are not checking the negativity now. So 2 weeks after symptom resolution, you can resume your vaccination. If you have a patient who's admitted with, even with the COVID-19 infection, remember the baby can be vaccinated at discharge if you don't have logistic issues. So that is also important for us to remember, to keep an eye on the vaccination status. Now coming to the COVID in children. So COVID and the pediatric age group, the difference is you have all the variations. You have infant, you have your newborn, and then you have the adolescents who would probably behave more like an adult than a child. So would be touching upon certain parts of the adult guidelines too for the benefit of the adolescents. So most of the symptoms are common to adult as well as children, but what the fever is more common, cough is there. And usually they would not be telling you about the loss of taste and smell, but they may have a little refusal to feed that may indicate probably the taste and smell is not there. GI symptoms are pretty common in children. Almost 10% have GI symptoms. And atypical manifestations are definitely COVID toes, that is small erythematous nodules, which are seen both on toes and fingers. We have seen rarely this. GI symptoms, as I said, is common, and definitely the red eye, red lip, rash baby should always, MISC should be thought of. Now coming to the pathogenesis, we all know that SARS-CoV-2 is mainly a respiratory pathogen which enters your respiratory tract through the anterior nares, and then through the ACE receptors, it reaches your lungs. But we all know that the manifestations of acute COVID is not just related or restricted to the lung. Other organs are also involved. That is because these organs also have ACE receptors. You can have a myriad of manifestations due to acute COVID infection. But what I would like to highlight in a child is that in an acute COVID infection time, we are definitely seeing a higher incidence of diabetic ketoacidosis, new onset DKA. So during this period, we need to be careful about any child presenting to you with lethargy, polyuria, polydipsia, altered sensorium, increased respiratory rate. Do think of DKA because the incidence is higher during acute COVID. Next month, we would be not expecting DKAs, but we would be expecting the MISC cases to come next month, that is 2 to 3 weeks after an acute COVID peak has happened. You expect the MISC to peak. Now, coming to certain manifestations in case of acute COVID infection, we need to know one of the commonest terms that is used is the happy hypoxemia. The reason is only 50% of patients who have a CT evidence of lung involvement will have clinical hypoxia. And only 50% of those who have hypoxia will complain of breathlessness. So that is the paradox here. That means even when the lung is involved, the symptoms may be lesser in the initial period, but subsequently, definitely the symptoms become worse. So early picking up of the disease is of paramount importance for proper management. So the causes of happy hypoxia, we know initially it is because of the hyperperfusion of the lungs leading on to ventilation perfusion mismatch, because lungs areas which are less ventilated also get too much of blood. Subsequently, there is the pulmonary thrombophlebitis causing micro as well as macro thrombus inside the lungs, again causing ventilation perfusion mismatch. There is also a postulation of coronavirus affecting the heme metabolism, causing uncoupling of iron, leading on to decreased transport of oxygen by the hemoglobin. This is just a postulation and has not been proven. And of course, we also have a shift of oxygen dissociation curve to the left. That is when you are hyperventilating, even when you're hypoxia, even when you're having happy hypoxia, even when you're not complaining about feeling breathless. But if you examine these patients, they do have tachypnea. So when you have a tachypnea, you are hyperventilating, you're causing the PuCO2 to fall, your pH will be increasing, shifting the oxygen dissociation curve to the left, which basically means that you will have a higher SpO2 for a corresponding lower PaO2. So even when your SpO2 looks higher, the PaO2 may be lower with lesser delivery of oxygen to the tissue. So that is the importance of shift of dissociation curve to the left. So moving on to another symptom, that is when you have a cough. The initial cough in the first 5 days is definitely because of the upper respiratory infection you are having. It may be because of the postnasal rep, the URA, the sore throat, all can cause cough. But when the cough lasts beyond the 5th day, you should know that it is often due to inflammatory cell infiltration, especially to the interstitium, causing interstitial edema. This is the reason why in adults, they look for the exertional dyspnea and they prescribe a Budecort inhaler for a cough that is lasting beyond the 5 days, because it is assumed that it is due to interstitial edema. But we should know that we do not have any equivalent for children, and we don't have any recommendations regarding use of Budecort in children. But probably if you have adolescents and they're complaining of cough beyond 5 days, may have a role. That's all we can say at present with the limited scientific evidence we have. Budecort has been found to be associated with decreased need of urgent medical care and reduced time to recovery. In the UK, NHS now recommends Budecort for patients above 50 years of age if they have symptoms, if the duration of illness is less than 14 days. Now coming to the resting breathlessness. So we always say that watch out for saturation, check your SpO2, walk, you do a 40-step walk and then see if your saturation is coming down. The importance of resting breathlessness and the importance of your saturation coming below 94% is that by this time, it is not only the interstitium that is edematous. By this time, your inflammatory cells have damaged your alveolar epithelium and fluid has accumulated inside your alveoli. So that means the inflammation has progressed into the alveoli, your surfactant has come down. That is the reason of hypoxia. The dissociation oxygen movement into the blood vessel has decreased. And that is why if you have a resting breathlessness and if you have a hypoxia, oral steroids are recommended and not inhaled steroids. Pathogenesis, so we should again highlighting the fact that in the initial viremic phase, it is the fever, sore throat, the GI symptoms that predominate. When the lung manifestations happen, the virus is still there, but the cytokines have also started to come in. And finally, when you go on to develop an ARDS or a multi-organ dysfunction, it is mainly the cytokines and not the virus. So we now understand that when you have the manifestations of acute COVID infection, initially it is the virus and subsequently the virus decreases and it is the cytokine storm that is taking over. So keeping that in mind, we need to formulate our treatment policies. So now moving on to treatment, the world all over has joined hands to find a treatment for COVID-19, but we know that we haven't come across any magic bullet for this disease, but let us see how we can provide the supportive care. So remember the old category A, and the category B, that is patients with comorbidities. We need to understand that both category A and category B are in fact upper respiratory infections. It is the category C, which includes the moderate as well as severe disease. So that is very important for us to understand that category A and B is essentially upper respiratory infection, and lower respiratory infection and organs are mainly the category C. So we call it as category C moderate if the patient has tachypnea with saturation between 90 to 94%. We say the clinical severity as severe if the saturation is less than 90% or the patient has danger signs like altered sensorium, shock, seizures, feed, or poor inability to feed, grunting. All that would come under category C severe. So from that, let us see how we manage. If we have a category A patient, that is a mild case who's having an upper respiratory infection, often without a fever, naturally you can manage symptomatically at home. If a facility for isolation is not there, they can be taken care of in CFLTC also. But please, there is no role for antivirals, no antibiotics, no investigations. But if the same patient is having, when the patient is at home, we need to tell the mother that they need to look for the red flag signs like breathlessness, poor feeding, altered sensorium, easy fatigability, seizures, syncope. All this has to be looked for. And we should ask the mother to come back to the hospital if any of the red flag signs develop. If the patient is admitted in a primary health care, we can have a monitoring chart like this, monitoring the respiratory rate, the urine output, danger signs, and saturation, as well as feeding 3 times daily to pick up deterioration early. So the patient whom you have sent home with a symptomatic treatment, you need to say that you need to come back to the hospital if there is a danger sign, and also if the fever and cough is not subsiding or increasing by day 5. So if you have a fever and cough beyond the 5th day, screen for secondary infection, a blood routine, and CRP is definitely indicated at this point. Regarding Budecort MDI 400 microgram BD, that is still a debatable question whether to give or not. For smaller children, definitely wouldn't recommend, especially you wouldn't prescribe it for a baby who's already sitting at home, because you would definitely want to see the patient and decide what to do. So as of now, no Budecort. For smaller children. For adolescents, you can think about it. Coming to the category B, that means a patient who's got the milder disease but has fever, or someone who has got a comorbidity. Here again, I would like to highlight that the comorbidity that you should be really scared of would be an adolescent with obesity and also patients with malignancy. We are definitely seeing patients with malignancy coming with very severe disease. So that is also one group we need to be always cautious about. But management-wise, here again, there is no role for antivirals, no role for the routine ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, or azithromycin. One word about the ivermectin, we need to know that there are myriad of studies from all over the world with ivermectin. There are studies which are telling that it decreases mortality. There are studies which are telling that there is no difference. There are studies which are telling even that that increases the mortality. We need to know that ivermectin does have an antiviral property in vitro, but the concentration needed for that antiviral property is close to 100 times more than what you normally achieve by the routine dose. So as of now, there is no strong scientific evidence. It's contraindicated in pregnancy, lactation, and children, and especially do not combine with azithromycin because of the metabolism using the cytochrome P450, and definitely not indicated in contact prophylaxis. So moving on to the moderate disease. So moderate disease is a child who's having a tachypnea with or without a mild hypoxia. So this would be a baby like this who's happy with you, but when you examine, he's having a tachypnea or hypoxia. So here your priority is definitely admission of the child and providing him appropriate oxygen to have an appropriate saturation. Investigations are not recommended in all. There is no role for antivirals, no routine antibiotics. But if your baby is less than 5 years of age, if your child is immunosuppressed, or you have a high suspicion of a bacterial infection, antibiotics may be given, and what is usually recommended is an amoxicillin, so that you could pick up deteriorations early. And you should also know that secondary infections per se is very rare in COVID infections, unlike the H1N1 infections, where secondary infections are common. And even when you have, but in children, we are definitely expecting a higher secondary infection compared to the adults. But when you say a moderate disease, you need to monitor the vitals. And the most important thing that we need to monitor is the work of breathing as well as the sensorium of the child. So even when the saturation is 90 to 94, if you find that there is lower chest retractions, or you find that the sensorium is not good, please remember it is no more a moderate disease. It is a severe disease, which requires a reference to either the tertiary care hospital or a designated COVID care hospital. So oxygen delivery devices, you have different. You can provide it with an oxygen prongs, with an oxygen hood, with a Venturi mask, a routine face mask, or an NRM. But I add with a saturation aimed at 94 to 98%. So please remember, do not target a saturation of 100%, because a 100% saturation means your PaO2 may be 80 or 90, or your PaO2 may be 400. So you don't want hyperoxia to happen. That is why you want the saturation with an oxygen supplementation, preferably between 94 to 98. When your child is recovering, that means the tachypnea has come down, the baby is happy, there are no danger signs, no fever, then you needn't target a saturation of 94. At recovery, a saturation of 90 is enough. And this is not just for COVID, this is applicable for your routine bronchiolitis also. Admission saturation, you want above 94, but discharge saturation 90 is enough if otherwise the baby is normal. But I would say if you're working at a primary care center where you don't have a facility for a tertiary care or an ICU, then for a moderate case, all I would recommend is an oxygen delivery using a prongs. If the baby is not responding to a routine prongs, it is to maintain a saturation above 94%, it would be preferable to refer to a higher center, so that because children often, once they start deteriorating, they deteriorate quite rapidly. And NRM provides very high FiO2, that is 80 to 90%. So routine use of NRM in a primary health center, definitely I wouldn't recommend. I would say that if the baby is requiring an NRM to maintain a saturation above 94, then with the NRM, if facilities you can definitely refer to a higher center. So this we are discussing about moderate disease being managed in a primary setup or a designated COVID care where you don't have facility for an HDU or ICU care. Then moving on to the moderate disease, what do you investigate? If the patient, especially if the patient's fever is persisting and not showing a satisfactory improvement, definitely a CBC, CRP, and a chest X-ray is mandatory. And a patient not showing improvement, organ functions and inflammatory markers can also be checked. If your patient is happy with a mild tachypnea, investigations are not mandatory, but whenever you find that it is not responding, investigations can definitely be done. A word about the aerosol therapy. With the monsoon here, we are going to see more children with wheeze. So if the baby requires beta-2 agonist therapy, please avoid nebulizers as far as possible and use MDI spacer with mask irrespective of the age. Even when you get a 12-year-old child, you should know that when you are having an acute exacerbation of wheeze, pursing your lips around a canister or around a spacer without a mask becomes difficult. So even for adults, if you're having an acute exacerbation, a mask is much more comfortable to deliver the MDI. And regarding, we should also know that when you're using a nebulization, aerosol is definitely generated. So some severe cases, you may require or you may feel like giving a nebulization. Then what can be done to decrease the aerosolization? So you can, it is the bigger child, mouthpiece would be preferable to deliver. But when you're using a mouthpiece also, the exhalation is happening into the environment. You can put a filter there so that the aerosolization into the environment is minimized. And it has been found that using a filter is 93% effective in capturing the exhaled aerosol droplets. Then if you have an infant, you can use a hood and attach a nebulizer to it, and it has a nebulizing chamber to it like this. And it has been found that this is as effective as using a nebulization using a face mask. The drug delivery to the lungs is similar. So this can definitely be used. It's more comfortable for an infant, and your chance of aerosolization is also less. And you can also use an oxygen hood with the side ports covered with a face mask for delivery of nebulization. So now why I said so much about nebulization is that there's in adult, the studies have shown that when you're using a nebulization, the viral load that is detected from the forehead is higher than what is derived from the abdomen or what is derived from the foot. So that means if you're providing a nebulization, it would be preferable for the healthcare worker to maintain a distance of at least 6 feet as far as possible for the duration so that you are exposed lesser to the viral load. And and always remember, when you're providing a nebulization, you should have the protective gear, especially the goggles or the face shield. Goggles would be preferable because AC receptors are there in abundance in your conjunctiva also. So moving on to the severe disease, it's here again, it is a supportive management, and steroids are definitely recommended here. And remdesivir may or may not be given. The national guidelines now recommend remdesivir only if the duration of symptoms is less than 3 days. Whereas the WHO has done away with remdesivir, the state government continues to recommend it up to 10 days. I would say preferable to use within 5 days, maybe given up to 10 days, definite no role beyond 10 days. Remember, remdesivir does not have a mortality benefit, but it has been found to decrease the duration of hospital stay by 3 days. So it may be used in indicated cases where you are getting the patient early. And regarding whether you can use it in a newborn, again, I said not newborn at birth. A newborn has gone home and come back with the classical signs of an acute COVID infection. The emergency use authorization is there for babies above 3.5 kgs. And if you have a risk factor for coagulation, and the patient has no contraindication, definitely low molecular weight heparin can also be given in severe cases. Then the oxygen support, usually it's the high flow nasal cannula that is preferred here. Always remember that if the patient has wheeze or if you're planning to procure an HFNC, do opt for a mesh nebulizing chamber, because the advantage of this is that it is not in the line of the ventilator circuit. It is outside the line of the ventilator circuit. So when you're adding the mesh drug, you are not opening the circuit. So use these nebulizers not only for HFNC, this can be used for NIVs as well as for invasive ventilators, which would prevent aerosolization as well as breakage of circuit frequent. If it is a bigger child and who is on HFNC, especially a child above 2 years of age, you can provide him with a surgical mask. Please do not use mask in children less than 2 years of age, because there is always a risk of suffocation. And of course, if it's a smaller child, just like before, we can use a hood covered with a surgical mask to decrease the risk of aerosolization. HFNC definitely cause aerosolization. Nasal prongs does not cause aerosolization or droplet. If you're using an NIV, please do not use the conventional NIV for COVID, because here the exhalation is happening completely to the environment and you would be creating a very good number of droplet as well as aerosols. It is better to use the conventional ventilator using an oronasal mask, and putting a filter at the exhalation port would help you decrease the aerosolization. And also, when you're starting the ventilator for an NIV, please start with the CPAP mode so that the gush of air is less. And after that, you can dial in the IPAP at leisure for the comfort of the patient. Now coming to the most important or the most common one as a pediatrician that we would be encountering would be definitely the MISC. As you can see here that it is after the COVID peaks. It is 3 to 4 weeks after the COVID peak, you are going to get an MISC. And as I said, we are expecting more cases of MISC next month rather than this month. The early reports were from Europe and North America, where they found that clusters of children were presenting with shock with multi-organ involvement who had features similar to Kawasaki disease or a toxic shock syndrome. That is especially the conjunctival congestion and the rashes. But now it is well established that multi-system inflammatory syndrome is a complication of COVID infection, which is manifesting 3 to 4 weeks after a COVID infection. But we need to remember that often the COVID infection itself is asymptomatic or mild, and the MISC becomes symptomatic. Now, let us see how these present. So we have here 4 cases. 8-year-old Nitin had severe abdominal pain. The patient was admitted in pediatric surgery. USG was suggestive of acute appendicitis. The child was taken up for surgery. Post-surgery, the child developed a shock, and the rash was still persisting, and the patient was referred to the pediatric side. 8-year-old child Asna had fever of 5 days duration with generalized rash and myalgia. Her total count was 9,800 with a platelet of 68,000. The child was referred as a case of dengue. 2-year-old Hannah had fever with loose stools and seizures. Child was referred as a case of febrile seizure, bar Shigella encephalopathy, while 12-year-old Kevin was admitted initially with headache and hypertension for evaluation, but subsequently developed a fever and shock. So you can see the myriad manifestations the patients have presented with. All of these cases subsequently turned out to be MISC. Now, how do these children really come to us, or what is common in them? So why is it that some children develop a hyperinflammatory syndrome and some don't? The answer is we really don't know, but it is postulated that when you have a viral invasion, if the body responds with a good interferon response, then the viral load is usually less and you recover faster and there is less inflammation. On the other side, if your body responds to a viral infection with more of interleukin 6 and chemokines, then the chance of developing hyperinflammatory syndrome is more. So from there, we need to know that the age incidence of MISC is definitely higher in higher age group than in younger age group, but MISC in newborns are also reported, but that is definitely very, very rare. And newborn at birth, please don't think about MISC. Think about MISC when a patient is coming to you with a fever, shock, or a cardiac manifestation, probably 2 to 3 weeks after delivery. Then moving on to the criteria for diagnosis of for MISC, we know that it is a child who's having a fever. Don't wait for 3 days, even 1 day fever is enough, with evidence of organ involvement and inflammatory markers with an SARS-CoV-2 infection. SARS-CoV-2 infection, patient may be RT-PCR positive, maybe antibody positive, or maybe epidemiologically linked to a COVID-19 case. So for the time being, in the present scenario, when we have a community outbreak of COVID-19, so there is definitely no hard and fast rule that you need to have an evidence of COVID-19 infection, but definitely checking for antibodies and antigen or RT-PCR is mandatory. But even when negative, it can be, if the patient fulfills the criteria of MISC, and be taken as MISC. So here what we have to remember is that all these criteria need to be filled. That means the patient should have evidence, have fever. The patient should have evidence of at least 2 organ involvements. Patient should have high inflammatory markers. Only then we can take it as a MISC. The clinical features, when we evaluated our children who were admitted in SET with MISC, we have close to 70 patients with MISC now. You can find that more than 65% of all patients will have mucocutaneous manifestations, shock, and GI symptoms. 100% have evidence of coagulopathy, even though clinical myocarditis is seen only in 30% of cases, but echocardiographic or biochemical markers show cardiac involvement in 90% of cases. That means they may have either LV dysfunction, or they may have specific or non-specific coronary changes, or they may have a high NT-proBNP or troponin. So that is important to note. When you look at the investigations, here again you can see that CRP more than 60 is present in close to 100% of cases. NT-proBNP and D-dimer is also seen in more than 90% of cases. So for all practical purposes, when you are suspecting a case of MISC, all these 3 is often present in more than 90% cases, but ESR you can see only less than 50% will have a high ESR. So the skin manifestations can be a simple erythema. You can have small maculopapular rashes. You can also have erythema multiforme like lesions, and sometimes even vasculitic rashes may be reported. Excuse me. So moving on to the conjunctiva in MISC, you can have small conjunctival, mild conjunctival conditions with perilimbal sparing, or you can have small hemorrhages, or you can have moderate or very severe hemorrhages in the eyes. So even though this is not much reported in the literature, but what we have found is that significant proportion of patients have conjunctival hemorrhage, and once you have conjunctival hemorrhage, It is really in favor of MISC if the other criteria are fulfilled. In adults, commonly in lepto, we are telling in conjunctival hemorrhages. In children, conjunctival hemorrhages in lepto is less. Usually they come with congestion more. So hemorrhage often is a very good indicator of MISC. Now coming to how do you really approach when you are, how to suspect and how you systematically approach a case of MISC. If a patient presents to you with fever, with GI symptoms, shock, acute abdomen, CNS manifestations or rash, think about MISC. So once you think about MISC, send for CRP as well as ESR. Either the CRP has to be more than 40 or the more than 60 or ESR more than 40. So one of this is mandatory. If you don't have one of these, please don't proceed further. So this is mandatory. So if one of these are positive, go ahead and do the second line investigations. That is, you need to look for neutrophilia, lymphocytopenia, thrombocytopenia, hyponatremia, and hypoalbuminemia. I would say that these manifestations, even though they are telling any one is enough, now you have the RCPCH guidelines, which are telling that they require the 3 of it. But in practice, usually when you're coming across a severe MISC, all these will be positive. It is not just any one of them. That is for a severe MISC. And once these are positive, then move ahead and do your second line investigations, which is the inflammatory markers like D-dimer, the coagulation profile, ferritin, TROP-T, NT-proBNP. Procalcitonin, even though recommended, we don't send routinely. Definitely, we haven't sent for anyone, in fact. And IL-6 also not mandatory. Definitely, we don't send. LDH can on fibrinogen can also be sent. So as I already said, among all these different inflammatory markers, what is most important or most sensitive is a D-dimer and NT-proBNP. Moving on to and before you start treatment, please remember, treat as MISC if no alternate diagnosis. So this is very, very important. All these features that I described is common to any severe disease that is coming to your ICU. Any patient coming to shock with sepsis or with lepto, with scrub, will have these manifestations because inflammatory markers are a very non-specific marker. So whenever you are having a severe infection, whenever you are having a shock, your circulation is sluggish, there is stasis of blood, there is microthrombi formation, naturally your D-dimer will be high. So these are very non-specific markers. So always look for alternate causes. And if there is no alternate causes, treat as MISC. And the treatment includes either you can use IVIG or you can use methylprednisolone. Now, IVIG is recommended to be combined with prednisolone 2 mg per kg per day. So especially we recommend IVIG when you have a smaller child with a typical presentation of Kawasaki disease. In our hospital, all bigger children or children presenting with shock are initially treated with methylprednisolone 30 mg per kg per day for the first 3 days, followed by oral prednisolone 2 mg per kg per day till the CRP normalizes. And then we taper it for the next 2 to 3 days. So many guidelines prefer immunoglobulin, but in our series, we have commonly used methylprednisolone and used IVIG very sparingly where indicated. And if the patient does not respond to IVIG, naturally your second option is going for methylprednisolone 30 mg per kg. And the other way around, if the patient is not responding to methylprednisolone, then go ahead and give IVIG. But if you're using methylprednisolone, you don't have to wait for 36 hours to say that it is refractory. After the 3 doses of methylprednisolone, if the fever is persisting, if the shock is still persisting, please go ahead and give IVIG. And then about the aspirin, aspirin should be prescribed for all children for whom MISC is diagnosed at a dose of 3 to 5 mg per kg per day. And usually it needs to be given till 4 weeks when the 4-week echo is normal. So even when the initial echo is normal, you need to give aspirin, and you can stop aspirin only when at the 4th week when they say that the repeat echo is also normal. Remember, we cannot give aspirin if your platelet counts are less than 80,000 and long-term aspirin is needed if the coronary artery aneurysm is persisting. Regarding anticoagulation, if you have a cardiac dysfunction with an ejection fraction less than 35%, then definitely use low molecular weight heparin. When you have severe MISC cases with thrombocytopenia between say 70-80%, and also liver dysfunction. What we find is that a significant proportion of patients with severe MISC do have liver enzyme derangement. So in that case, for the interim period, you can use low molecular weight heparin and subsequently change to aspirin at discharge. But if you have a documented thrombosis, or if you have a large coronary artery aneurysm, then you need to give therapeutic dose of low molecular weight heparin along with aspirin. Then what about fever with high inflammatory markers? So this is a very common scenario as pediatricians we are facing, because we are told to look for inflammatory markers for any child who's coming with fever. And you check the inflammatory markers, they are skyrocketing. You refer the child, by the child reaches a tertiary center. Sometimes the fever has subsided, but the inflammatory markers are high. Then what do you do? The answer is a little tricky here, but I would say that if your inflammatory markers are high and the patient is not running a fever, please check the repeat inflammatory markers after 48 hours. If after 48 hours, the inflammatory markers continues to rise, then you're justified in giving oral prednisolone 2 mg per kg per day for 10 days, followed by 1 mg per kg per day for 5 days of oral prednisolone. And if your inflammatory markers have come down, but your D-dimer continues to rise, then definitely aspirin can be given for 4 weeks and echo can be done subsequently. Here, I would also like to say that this we would define as a mild MISC. In the recent ACR guidelines, which has come out, the version 3 is now recommending even for mild disease and IVIG, which we are not definitely routinely giving. Moving on to a case to highlight the similarities. You can see here, this was a child who presented with fever of 5 days duration in shock. And you can see how congested his lips as well as tongue is. And he also had a papular rash. And when you look at the investigations, you realize that CRP is 150 with a total count of 24,500 with polypredominance. His albumin was 2.9 with a serum sodium of 132. D-dimer was 4,000 with NT-proBNP of 1,009. So what you see here is this child has completely fulfilled all the criteria for MISC. He's having fever, he's having organ dysfunction, he's having hyperinflammation, and he's also having the inflammatory, second-line inflammatory markers are all high. But when you look carefully, you would realize that this child also has an acute infection in the ankle. So this was in fact a case of toxic shock syndrome. So this child was never treated with an immunomodulation therapy. So this is one thing we need to remember. Toxic shock syndrome and MISC are very, very similar. It is very difficult to distinguish between the two. And that is also the exact reason every child with MISC gets an empiric treatment with a ceftriaxone and clindamycin. We have come across 2 cases of scrub as well as 1 case of lepto. All the 3 were PCR positive, who also fulfilled all criteria for MISC. So now our protocol for empiric antibiotic includes doxycycline also. So always look for an alternate diagnosis. This is a great masquerader. So now moving on to remember, we already said TSS, dengue, lepto, and scrub should always be kept in mind. And all children with MISC do send a blood culture and do send investigations for dengue, lepto, and scrub. Now, in this time of monsoon, you are definitely seeing dengue cases are slowly increasing. So dengue is a very close DD. So how do you differentiate between a dengue and an MISC? So what is common between an MISC and dengue is that both will appear flushed, both will complain of myalgia and arthralgia, both can present with shock, and both will have thrombocytopenia. But the difference is a dengue will not have an high CRP unless it is a small baby or there is a co-infection. So high CRP favors diagnosis of MISC rather than dengue. Similarly, a dengue, when they present in shock, the PCV will always be high. There will be hemoconcentration unless the patient is bleeding. So a suspected dengue in shock with normal PCV should ring a bell and think for alternative diagnosis. It is unlikely to be a dengue. And high ESR, this almost rules out a dengue. A dengue in shock, if you're having an ESR more than 20, you definitely rule out dengue, because dengue is always associated with a low ESR, especially because again, it is a hemoconcentration that is causing the BP fall. Neutrophilia and lymphopenia, I would say, will exist in both. So just because you find neutrophilia, don't say that it is not dengue, because when we look at severe dengue cases admitted in ICU, we have seen that lymphopenia and cytopenias are seen only in 20% of cases. The other cases are showing neutrophilia as well as a higher count. So we should not be, counts will not differentiate between MISC and dengue. The other things would help you distinguish between MISC and dengue. So with that, we conclude with the take-home messages. So the first is COVID-19 treatment in children is mainly symptomatic. Mild disease can be managed at home care with symptomatic treatment. Moderate disease is mainly a question of providing oxygen with appropriate saturation target. Antibiotics have a role in some subgroup of patients. Steroids is of doubtful use, but if the duration of disease is more than 5 days, definitely steroids can be prescribed. If it is a severe disease, the child definitely requires an admission in a tertiary care. Here again, it is the mode of ventilation as well as remdesivir we should know no mortality benefit, but certain select subgroup of patients may benefit with remdesivir. There is no definite role for antivirals, tocilizumab, convalescent plasma, or ivermectin in children. And MISC should be suspected in children presenting with fever, with organ dysfunction. And also don't forget about the MISC masqueraders regarding diagnosis as well as regarding treatment. So with that, we know that no storm lasts forever. So let us hope that this will also go and we'll have better days coming. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. Your presentation is very informative and excellent. So, dear members, it's a time for clearing doubts. Anyone can ask doubts? Dear members? Anish?
Please unmute and you can ask your doubts, if any, to Shija madam.
I think there is a question in the chat box. You have
Yes.
a high grade fever and pain and diarrhea with vomiting post-COVID 3 months. The CRP is 32 with an ESR of 8. Should it be treated as a MISC? I would say no. At this point, definitely no indication, because your CRP is only 32. So for you to really think about an MISC, the CRP has to go above 60. So we would provide a symptomatic treatment and keep a tab on the child. If the child is not responding, we would repeat the inflammatory markers and then decide. This would not be taken as an MISC.
Is there any association of generalized lymphadenopathy or cervical lymphadenopathy alone in MISC?
MISC, definitely lymphadenopathy is seen, but the percentage of patients presenting MISC with lymphadenopathy is definitely lesser. So Kawasaki, how much we are seeing the isolated lymphadenopathy, we are not seeing that much in MISC, definitely.
So in a periphery setup, suppose you suspect a patient with MISC, can you start steroids without further investigations? Suppose it's a life-saving measure also, especially in this COVID era.
Because we need to understand that the CRP may be high in infections also. But just by looking at the high CRP, we are definitely not just.
Madam, please unmute, madam. Sorry, madam.
So I think the question is if you in a peripheral setup.
Patient with multi-system involvement without lab investigations can be straight away start on steroids and.
I would say that no, because just imagine if the patient is really having a sepsis and having a multi-system involvement. So giving a high dose of steroid for a child he's probably septic, would be definitely detrimental. And we definitely would like to have, because when the audit happens also, it is important that we stick on to the guidelines. So definitely investigations വേണം. അതിൽ ഒത്തിരി investigations വേണ്ട. Just looking at the CRP and the ESR, if the CRP is high, at least the D-dimer. NT-proBNP vare poyillelum, no problem. But if the D-dimer is also high and you are not getting an alternative diagnosis, probably you are justified. Otherwise, we are not justified. Definitely not.
Post-COVID era, maybe say right. So what's the outcome? What's the results nowadays with this MISC patients?
No, MISC,
No, it's in
definitely
CT.
the MISC outcomes are definitely good. Initially, the outcomes were bad because the diagnosis was getting late, and naturally the patients were presenting bad. But even now, you get a very bad multi-system involvement, very bad shock requiring multiple inotropes going on for many days, some requiring ventilation. But in general, the outcome is very good. As of now, we haven't had a mortality with MISC till now.
Children with the myocarditis, do they recover completely? The myocarditis part, do they recover completely? The
Do they
myocarditis
recover
part of
completely? Was that the question?
the myocarditis part, the patients may present with myocarditis.
No, myocarditis also has a very good recovery, because some of the children, you will find that within days, within 2 to 3 days itself, the myocardial contractility improves. But some are there which on follow-up also their contractility is poor. The thrombus may not have completely resolved, and they are on drugs. So there is a very small subgroup. The majority, the resolution happens very fast. And even those who have persistent LV dysfunction, most of them recover by 6 weeks to 6 months. So a persisting LV dysfunction beyond 6 months is definitely rare.
Madam, ഈ onset of symptoms MISC സ്റ്റാർട്ട് ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് എന്തെങ്കിലും നമുക്കൊരു റെഗുലർ ടൈം ഗ്യാപ്പ് ഉണ്ടോ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ ഒരു 2 weeks കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മൾ സേഫ് ആണ്, അങ്ങനെ വല്ലതും പറയാൻ പറ്റുമോ?
I think you are asking about ഒരു കോവിഡ് ഇൻഫെക്ഷൻ വന്നു, അത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് 2 weeks കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ടേ MISC വരുള്ളൂ, 2 weeks ഇടയ്ക്ക് MISC വരില്ല, അതല്ലേ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ഉദ്ദേശിച്ചത്? No, definitely not, because a significant proportion of patients who come with MISC are RT-PCR positive. But you should also know that a proportion of patients who are RT-PCR positive, if you send a COVID antibody at admission, they are also antibody positive. That means that the virus that you have detected by RT-PCR is probably an innocent bystander. Already viremia നേരത്തെ വന്നതായിരിക്കും, ഇപ്പൊ MISC ആയിട്ട് present ചെയ്യുന്നത്.
Hospital based
interval at admission itself you can have RT-PCR positivity.
Hospital
മാഡം ഓൺസെറ്റും ഇതുമായിട്ട് ടൈം ഡ്യൂറേഷൻ ഒന്നും പറയാൻ പറ്റത്തില്ല.
ഇല്ല, അതാ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞു, അഡ്മിറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന സമയത്ത് തന്നെ അക്യൂട്ടിന്റെ എവിഡൻസും കാണും. എപ്പോഴും കാണണമെന്നില്ല. ഒരു നല്ലൊരു ശതമാനം പേഷ്യന്റ് RT-PCR നെഗറ്റീവ് ആയിരിക്കും, കോവിഡ് ആന്റിബോഡി പോസിറ്റീവ് ആയിരിക്കും. വേറൊരു സബ് ഗ്രൂപ്പ് RT-PCR പോസിറ്റീവ് ആണ്. അപ്പൊ നമുക്ക് ഇന്റർവെൽ പറയാൻ പറ്റില്ലല്ലോ. അവര് തിയററ്റിക്കലി പറയുന്നത് 2 to 3 weeks കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ടാ വരുന്നത് എന്നുള്ളത്. പക്ഷെ നമ്മൾ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ഡെഫിനറ്റ്ലി RT-PCR പോസിറ്റീവ് ഉള്ള ഒരു സിഗ്നിഫിക്കന്റ് നമ്പർ ഉണ്ട്. I think another question asked this, with increasing D-dimer in acute COVID infection, but child does not have hypoxia or dyspnea, should we start low molecular weight heparin? Definitely not. And I would say that please don't send D-dimer unless it is indicated. So if after 5 days the patient is symptomatic, definitely there is a role for looking for CRP, and if CRP is high, to go for a D-dimer. So if you find that the D-dimer is pretty high or increasing, the drug that would be recommended would be an aspirin. But this is a very common phenomenon. If you really look, the D-dimers are really high. It's better we send when the real indication is there. The other question asked is 14-year-old adolescent girl with fever and vomiting of 7 days. CRP is 60, ESR is 40. Total count is 2,300 with neutrophilia. Platelet is 1.5. She is fine with ceftriaxone and symptomatic treatment. Lepto dengue negative. Whether to do D-dimer, report awaited. Antigen and RT-PCR is negative. Okay, very good question. So here what we are seeing is that you are having a patient who is having fever with a GI symptom. So there is an organ involvement, there is fever. You require at least 2 organ involvement. So if this patient's D dimer is high, it becomes 2 because coagulopathy is taken as an organ involvement. Now this, and you have, the patient has responded to ceftriaxone. So the patient has responded to ceftriaxone. It is probably a bacterial infection which has manifested. So, but since everything is high, and since the child is better, definitely here you wouldn't be doing anything. But if your D dimer comes as very high, we would definitely repeat after 48 hours to see that we are not missing an MIS. Otherwise, since the child has responded to antibiotic, it is unlikely to be an MIS. High CRP with normal ESR, should we take CRP as significant? Yes, that is significant. ESR is not significant. In MISC, as I said, less than 50% will have an high ESR. Almost 100% will have a high CRP. So always rely on CRP rather than ESR. Sometimes the ESR is as low as 5, 7 and all. So ESR is not at all sensitive to pick up patients with MISC. CRP is more sensitive. Any value of above 1 of COVID antibody is taken as positive. This answer is a little difficult because every kit has a different cutoff value, and this is not exactly the antibody level. It is something else. They keep it as a normal level, and above that, that is taken as positive. It's not the real, it is not a quantitative. It is a qualitative one, a semi-quantitative, you can say. So everything has a different, like the present kit that we have, it takes 50 as normal. And above 50 is taken as positive. അപ്പം ആ കിറ്റിൽ എത്രയാണോ പറയുന്നത് അത് വെച്ചിട്ട് പോസിറ്റീവ് പറയാം. എല്ലാ കിറ്റിലും നമുക്ക് ടൈറ്റേഴ്സ് കിട്ടത്തില്ല. No more questions.
ബാബു സാറെ വേറെ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ഒന്നും ഇല്ലാന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു.
Any?
Pediatricians
Babu
ഇല്ലേ?
സാറേ?
Pediatricians.
Yes.
വേറെ ആരും ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആൽഫ്രഡ് സാർ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു.
Alfred sir.
Hello,
Alfred sir
President.
ഇല്ല.
Sir.
President, I congratulate the team IMA Kollam for organizing such a wonderful CME, because I think the participation was reached 100, and many friends called me that they are not able to join because the limit is 100. Madam, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really very explicit, very clear. Thank you very much. Congratulations. Thank you all.
Madam, IMA Kollam branch is very much thankful to you, madam. Your presentation was very excellent and very informative. Anyway, its time is 9. So if nobody is having any doubts, so I can invite our secretary, Dr. Anish Krishnan, for vote of thanks. Anish?
Yes, sir. Respected President, respected South Zone, IMA South Zone Vice President, Dr. Alfred B. Samuel, sir, respected President, Dr. Babu Chandran, sir, respected guest speaker, Dr. Sheija Sugunan, madam, and all my dear members, and all those who attended this meeting. Thank you, especially a special thanks for Sheija, madam, for accepting our invitation over phone in a short notice and giving this wonderful and crisp and clear presentation. I heard from my friends that madam is involved in formulating the guidelines for COVID treatment in children, and she is the best speaker in Kerala. From my friend, that day itself I called madam, and I think same time itself she agreed for the same. Thank you, madam. Thank you once again. Thank you all those who attended the meeting. I think many members were not able to join. Actually, our settings got changed automatically. Don't know what happened. We have to search. After 100 participants, many of them were not able to join. I think I have recorded the video with madam's permission. I will share the video with the recorded presentation with our members in our group. Thank you, madam. Thank you, one and all.
Good night.
Thank you, Sheija, madam. Thank you. So So the meeting is closed.